Good morning, everyone. Thank you, like Melina said, for being here. I just want to say that it has been a privilege and continues to be a privilege to work with everyone on this panel. So I don't have any disclosures to declare this morning. As Melina mentioned this morning, I'd like to talk to you about the validation approach that we took in FLS, which is an argument-based approach. So I'll be talking a little bit technically about argument-based validation, but I'll be highlighting some of the work that we've done with FLS. At the same time that I hope that through this technical discussion that those of you who are working with assessments and who are undertaking validation work get some morsels of information that will help guide your work in whatever area it is that you're working. So just a little bit discussion about assessment before we dig into the validation part. And that is that, as you all know, in surgical education, assessment is used in many, many different ways, from selecting candidates to measuring competence. And those competencies can be varied, they can be extremely complex to measure, and have high stakes attached to it. And for that reason, and for many others, it's extremely important to gather evidence that demonstrate that the assessments that we're making and the decisions that we're making about candidates are trustworthy, and that they're doing what they're meant to do and what we want them to do. This particular definition of validity is one that I like a lot. It's from Samuel Messick way back in 1989, and it states that validity always refers to the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationales support the adequacy and appropriateness of interpretations and actions based on test scores. So really highlighting the importance that validity is not a property of a test. It's very intuitive to say that test is valid. But what we're actually gathering evidence for is its uses and interpretations. So a very, very simple example is that of a driver's license test. We use it to make decisions about whether candidates are safe to drive independently on the road. They're not going to cause accidents. They're going to follow all of the rules. And the way we make those interpretations are, based on a driving test where you see if someone can do a three-point turn or follow traffic signals or whatever it may be. So when we talk about uses and interpretations, that's what we're talking about. And validation is really the systematic process of putting together all the evidence that we have, synthesizing it to make those judgments about the way we want to use whatever the assessment is and the interpretations that we're making from them. So moving to validity for now, why did we embark upon this validation study? I think first and foremost, and probably most importantly, in any assessment program, conducting validation work is part of ongoing quality improvement processes. It's part of building a validation narrative, part of building a story about that supports the uses and interpretations. We also wanted to proactively address the advancements and developments in laparoscopy, laparoscopic surgery, since FLS was developed over 15 years ago. And we really wanted to be responsive to the needs and expectations of stakeholders moving forward. So there are other approaches to validity, certainly, but a contemporary one is the argument-based approach. And it is ultimately a program of research because we do want to gather this validity evidence on an ongoing basis. And let's dig into it a little bit. It can get a little bit technical, so there is a specific set of vocabulary attached to argument-based validation. And perhaps most importantly are those claims. Those are statements that we make that highlight the conclusions that we want to make about any assessment by the end of it. So again, going back to the driver's license example, the claim that we want to make is that this test allows us to distinguish candidates who are prepared to or ready to be independent drivers. Inferences are essentially the evidence that we use to support or refute those claims. So what evidence are we using to infer whether those claims are valid or not? And together, warrants and assumptions, they allow us to be more specific about the types of evidence that we need and the type of data we need to gather to make those inferences about those claims. So how do we go about doing an argument-based approach to validation? There's three main actions. The first of which is, as I mentioned, to identify those claims. So you have a testing program. What are those conclusions that you want to make? So if we move specifically to FLS, we began by identifying those claims that we want to make about the FLS program. For example, FLS tests the laparoscopic surgery competencies required for the minimally qualified candidate. That is a claim that we want, for which we want to gather evidence to make sure that it's supported. And for each claim, we develop, again, those warrants and assumptions that allow us to make inferences about whether that claim is true or not. The second action is probably the fun part. That's actually doing the research. That's gathering the evidence in order to make decisions. And what the warrants and assumptions do is they allow us to articulate the specific research questions that we need to gather that evidence. So here's a very, very brief snapshot of some of those claims and the warrants and assumptions that led to the research questions that we used as the basis for our research. So again, using that validity claim that I highlighted a few seconds ago, some warrants or assumptions related to whether we can know whether FLS really does test the competencies required for the minimally qualified candidate. We assume that the cognitive test, so the multiple choice question of the exam, assesses the knowledge of the fundamentals of laparoscopic surgery. We also assume that the manual skills, all the 5 technical skills that are assessed, together assess the technical skills that are, again, fundamental to laparoscopic surgery. Using those assumptions, and there were others, we develop research questions for which we develop research methods to answer. And finally, action 3 is perhaps the most difficult part, because that's where you have to evaluate the evidence and synthesize it into a validity argument. So using a mixed methods approach, ideally, you're integrating across data sources, looking back and forth, and really synthesizing the data to determine whether or not you can support or refute those claims that you initially developed. So here are some examples of the types of data sources we used in our FLS validity examination. So everything from literature reviews to semi-structured interviews with different types of stakeholders to think aloud interviews. And once everything is done, here's a sample of how the data is presented. It's presented in a logical chain. It follows Toomlin's logic structure, if any of you are familiar with that. And I'm not going to delve too deep into it, but this just shows you the technicality of it, and it really highlights the relationship between claims, inferences, and you can see there's specific types of inferences highlighted, warrants that are used, and as well as the sources of evidence. It really pulls everything together. And so I want to conclude my talk by highlighting 2 very important questions that Bernard Spolsky way back in 1981 talked about when he talked about validity in any context. And he said that, you know, when you have an assessment program, there's really 2 questions you need to be able to answer. 1, how sure are you of your decision? And how sure are you of the evidence that you're using to make that decision? So with these guiding principles, regardless of whether you adopt an argument-based approach to validity or another, ultimately, I think these are the 2 questions that need to be answered. And with that, I thank you.